Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, and this day, in place of the normal thoughts of my own, I'd like to share with you my remembrance of the first producer of this program who has died. His name was Mahler. He was my friend, my encourager, my strong right arm for all the formative time of this program. Mike had worked for CBS. He was a radio person through and through with one of those beautiful round radio voices. But he did television just as well. He had a long career at CBS, a career at the United Nations, and finally he went a very long way to creating this program as a radio program. And initially it was a radio program, but in a very short time it became a television program. I missed him from the time that we no longer worked together because he was always there, always cheerful, always skillful, always professional, and fun. The laughter was fabulous. And I have a great love of working with people who can laugh. I'm so sad that Mike Mahler, producer, broadcaster, won't be laughing with me anymore. Today we have a very special guest on the program. He's Mark Blyth, who is the professor of political economy, the Eastman professor. That's correct, right,
That's
Mark?
correct, yes.
The Eastman professor of political economy at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And my first question has to be, why do they have such long names at universities?
Because they're different bits of universities, and everyone wants a mention the minute you're on television. So yeah, it's a bit like putting your sponsors in a NASCAR. You know, so did you enjoy the race, Mark? Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Parts and Oil. So it's a bit like that, unfortunately.
I see that. Okay, Eastman professor is with us. Linda Gasparello, of course, the co-host of this program,
Short
who also
title.
knew and worked with Mike Mahler.
Yes, I did.
And here we go. You know a lot about the euro, about the crisis in Europe, about the crisis sometimes it seems that is inspired by or worsened by austerity. You have books on the subject. Let's have a look at them. This is your first book, has been updated. It tells the story to a certain extent because it's austerity, the history of a dangerous idea, which sort of tells us where you stand, doesn't it?
Yes, it's not ambiguous.
And the future of the euro. I don't know whether this is going to encourage us when we get into it to rush out and buy euros forward. But the euro, the currency of the European Union, or a large chunk of it, which is under threat in some ways. Why is austerity a bad thing? There are people in this country who would like to see us cut back on government. What happens?
Well, it's a very simple notion. You know, we all need to tighten our belts to make sure that we're back into fiscal shape. But there's two problems. The first one is I'm absolutely in favor of everyone tightening their belts the minute we're all wearing the same pants. And that's manifestly not the case. In fact, it's more unlike the case than it's been in almost 100 years. So when you cut government spending, who feels the effects? Well, it's those of people who rely upon transfers directly or government services such as public schools, etc. So essentially what you're doing, particularly, remember, after a financial crisis, kind of like we had in 2008 when we bailed out the assets and incomes of everyone who has assets and incomes, well, when you do that, you're turning private debt into public debt, and then you freak out about the public debt and then start cutting school budgets. But the school teachers weren't the ones that caused the crisis, were they? So there's a real asymmetry in the way that this gets put. Second one is this. You can't all save at once. It's just impossible. For someone to save, there has to be someone else generating an income from which to save. Otherwise, all you're doing is shrinking the economy. So if you're in a moment of crisis and recession, and the public sector is shrinking at the same time as the private sector, then the overall economy shrinks. Now, if you want a crystal clear case of this, try Greece. Because there they went for austerity on steroids to restore confidence. Well, they lost 30% of consumption in the economy, nearly 30% of GDP, 20% cut in consumptive spending in the economy. The place is a disaster. So there's no real reason to do this other than the fact that you want someone else to pay for your mistakes, which is really what it's all about.
So in this economic picture, which is very confusing to people, because we have economists from the Chicago School, we have Keynesians, we have Marxists. I mean, apparently you can get an economist of any shade. And sometimes economists, I mean, there are lots of jokes about economists. I could tell you one. I'll tell you one. I was in Cuba years ago in the 80s, and I met with the economists. And they were very young, very funny, very full of energy, very Marxist. And they said, well, it was better to plan things. They believed, like Marxists. And they said, we've been working on where the best fishing grounds off Cuba are. But we have to redo everything because our model came out on land. And they did have the grace to laugh about this, but they were undeterred.
Undeterred. They often are undeterred.
And then there's the other joke about this during Soviet days, the great military display, and there are all these weapons go by, huge tanks and missiles, and then a bunch of shabby men, and somebody says, you know, they do the most damage. They're the economists.
They're the economists, yes.
That's an old joke.
You know the Lyndon Baines Johnson one? If you could bring me every economist in the United States and brought them end to end, they'd never reach a conclusion.
Yes, that's right.
What kind of economist are you?
A political economist. And what does that mean? It means that I do not actually believe that you can, through descriptions and manipulations of mathematics like calculus, describe emotion, fear, greed, bigotry, anger, all the things that actually drive real human beings. Take a very simple thing. At the heart of central banks and all that central banks do for forecasting the economy, there's a very complex thing, and it is very complex, called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling. And in essence, what it is an assumption the economy can be likened to a person, you. And you wander through life being hit by shocks, prices changing, etc., and you optimize all your decisions. Have you ever met anyone who behaves like this?
No.
No, neither have I. And that proved not to be a very good forecasting tool in 2008. We're still using them. I prefer to look to history. I prefer to look to what people have actually done in the past to think about what they might do in similar situations in the future.
Right.
And that's variously called history or journalism. But you know what? I think it's got a good deal of leverage to it.
Can I suggest that we have a fairly good example of the rigid truths of economy as opposed to the plenty that are not rigid with the euro, where certain things were inevitable, that if the weak countries would not be able to sell their goods because they'd be stuck with the euro, which was too expensive for them, and the rich country, primarily Germany, would be subsidized by this currency. And the politicians wouldn't listen. Mm-hmm. They introduced it because it was very appealing.
Absolutely.
And I will say that most of the media that writes about these things, and I include myself there, lent towards the idea. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a common currency so I can go to France and go on to Italy and swing back through Austria and not have a pile of change on the dressing table every night?
And that has been a very convenient thing, but the fact was we knew from the very beginning that there was going to be a tier of countries that wouldn't be able to support the euro.
Mark, this wasn't new, was it? This was understood that this had happened because of countries that had tried to use the dollar as their currency and had found they couldn't export anything because they had taken the hardest currency, often the hardest currency in the world, to try to fix a very weak economy.
Yes.
So now taking the example of Greece, which has had a bunch of disasters. It had the austerity disaster. It's having the euro disaster. What's the outlook for them? It's different than it is in Ireland, where they had a problem that was basically fixed by a bailout and a couple of bailouts.
Right. Well, there's lots of moving parts here. Let's go back to the start. The thing about economic ideas is that, to use the language of economics, there's too many variables and not enough data points. So what that means is you can kind of create a story that covers all the bases. It's a very believable story.
Yeah.
And then I can take another story and tell you another story that fits. You know, that one works too. And then there's another one. The problem with the story, with the euro, was there were multiple overlapping stories. So the first one was, never mind just the cash convenience, transactions cost stuff, a really good one was called optimal currency area. that
Yeah.
basically you could make the world more like a theory, and if it became more like this fabulous thing called an optimal currency area, then the economies would magically become more efficient. Forgetting, of course, that, the Greeks are still the Greeks, the Germans are still the Germans, put all that to one side, right? But on the other hand, you have exactly people saying, but hold on a minute, I mean, if the Greeks are very low productivity and the Italians are productive in the north but not in the south, and the French are great at services but lousy at manufactured exports, how does all this fit together? Well, it doesn't matter, because this other story tells us it'll be fine, right? So there's always multiple stories going on. Now, the reason we stopped caring about the stories was the giant credit bubble in the global economy that inflated from the time the euro went in, coincidentally, not causally, in 1999 right through to 2007. And what it meant was old people in the north were basically saving too much, and they were putting it in the Sparkasse in Germany, the savings bank, and it was going to the Grossbank, which would be Deutsche Bank, and they were buying Greek debt, which was allowing the Greeks to buy BMWs on credit from the Germans, right? And so long as it kept going, it was all working fine. Now, of course, along comes the unexpected of the global financial crash. The whole thing comes off the rails, and then all the sort of horrible fractures are exposed. And what Europe has been doing since then is trying to triage a system, which has effectively crashed. But the impacts of the crash are very different. Now, let's go to Ireland and Greece for a minute, right? Greece is the worst exporter in the entire EU. It just doesn't export very much. What it does is exports are, in a sense, services exports, because it imports Germans to sit on the beaches, right? It doesn't really export that much. Now, Germany exports lots and lots and lots, but then it makes it in China and sells it to Chinese, right? It's a huge export surplus. Massively different economies. Now, what does Ireland do? Ireland sits off the coast of England, which is actually its closest trading partner, and intermediates the tax dodges of Apple, Google, and a whole bunch of people. They charge 12.5% corporation tax, right?
Yeah.
Now,
so they got multinationals to go there.
So and then they do tax inversions from the United States, end up domiciled there, right? The whole lot. So what they end up with is they take a cut of everybody's tax dodges to balance their books. Now, the Greeks aren't doing this, can't do this, and have an entirely different economy. So when you say, let's all tighten our belts, what happens is the Irish grow through basically tax dodges and exports, and the Greeks have no exports and can't do the tax dodges. So they're walloped. Think about a country like Luxembourg. Luxembourg is the richest country in the world. It's about the size of this table. The entire thing exists as a giant corporate tax dodge. Now, the guy who runs the European Commission is the guy who used to run Luxembourg and set up all those tax dodges. And once you start to look into this, it's a very, very interesting and very different thing from the EU that we see represented.
Occasionally you get something, the exception, and there is one in Ireland that quite early in the attraction of multinationals, it found it had an asset that was desperately needed primarily in America, which was universal literacy, and that Irish women were prepared to do very detailed entries for computers, and that we were there quite frequently. We're part of an Irish think tank.
It was exploding.
And this was exploding. They had found an asset, and they could export without having roads and ports, etc., because they could export through computers. Nothing like that happened for Greece. All it had is tourism.
No, and the closest parallel to Ireland in that way, and it would be nice if Greece could do this, is what happened to Israel. So Israel in the 1970s into the 1980s, economy completely on its knees, decided to go heavy into technology and engineering, pharmaceuticals, etc., brought in Motorola, etc., and then really took off in those directions.
Absolutely.
Now, Greece, in principle, could do this. There's logistics hubs that could be in north of Greece. You've got the connections to Turkey, other areas. But basically, the EU at the moment is in this mindset whereby the only thing the Greeks need to do is keep paying their bills in perpetuity in an economy that's bust.
And what's happening with keeping paying their bills in perpetuity is that a lot of the businesses that actually operated on a main street are now going inside people's homes so that they don't actually have to declare anything.
I'd like to take a moment.
So they're not getting any of the money that they would have gotten from
station
taxes.
identification, primarily for our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, channel 124, the POTUS channel, where this program can be heard 4 times every weekend. You are listening to White House Chronicle with myself, Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello of this program, and the very interesting gentleman whose accent you will no doubt immediately recognize as being the accent of Robbie Burns from Scotland.
In fact, it's actually Robbie Burns' accent. I stole it from him. He wants it back.
And Mark Blyth is Eastman Professor of Political Economy at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And I would say to him that any economist would think that that is rather an inefficient title.
Right.
It is. It's a very inefficient title.
But we love it, and certainly a fascinating guest. This program can be seen on about 200 American television stations and heard and seen around the world on the Voice of America radio and television. Mark, what is your prescription for these ills?
So the euro's going to stick around. It might not have the same membership if we go out 5 years or 10 years from now. But the problem is, and think about the Greece in 2015.
Yeah.
It's so hard to get out.
Right.
Right? Now, let's take the analogy. When the Argentines had a dollar peg, they actually still had pesos in their pocket.
Yeah.
So when you break the peg, right, yes, you get inflation and the banks freak out and the middle classes lose savings and all the stuff that usually happens when you have a big adjustment. But how do you do this when you have the same money as Germany?
Yeah.
Right? Simply, the physics of redenominating is really, really difficult. The last major redenomination I'm aware of was Iraq. And it took the US military and the US Treasury 11 months to get it right. And even then, did they get it right? We don't know. So the costs of getting out are incredibly high. Now, what that means is a bunch of countries that really aren't doing well, precisely for the reasons you've identified, competitiveness relatively, et cetera, are going to be stuck with this currency. Now, this is what creates the political tensions in this to a large extent. So think about it this way. Germany's the champion exporter. On a per capita basis, they kill the Chinese. On a value-added basis, they kill the Chinese. They're running an 8% surplus in their exports. They're making money hand over fist. I have a Volkswagen TDI, as I like to call it, der Polluterwagen, right? The one that they're doing the recalls on, right? So I've got, and I'll be going back in the recall soon, right? But they're still making money, right?
Yeah.
Now, on the other side of this, you've got these countries that, because they're low productivity, effectively that means that the exchange rate of the Germans is artificially low. So I'm going to swap my TDI, excellent car, for a Golf Allroad, the new one they're bringing in as a sub, also excellent. There isn't an American car made that can come close to the quality on these things for price. Well, part of that is because they're drowning their currency in these low productivity economies and making their products cheaper than they otherwise would be. There's also the whole integration into Eastern Europe, which helps that way as well.
Sure.
Now, they're making money hand over fist. What's happening to France? They're stagnating. What's happening to Italy? It's grown 1% in the entire time since it's joined the euro.
Spain too.
Spain too. This is not going well for many others who are not on the good side of this trade.
Right.
And what's the fix?
Well, the fix is you build a whole series of institutions that no one wants. So you would have fiscal transfers, you would have a capital markets union. What does that actually mean? Think about the United States for a minute. When California goes bust, what happens? People move from California, they go somewhere else. They take their pensions with them.
Right.
In Germany, if Germany went bust, Germans went to Britain, the pension wouldn't travel. It's not portable. So fixing all those things, having transfers, having a common unemployment pool for unemployment insurance, creating greater labour mobility. But all of that means more Europe, precisely at a time when the Brits of others have said, we don't like this at all. We would like less Europe. So are there other fixes you can do? The most important one would be to do some kind of rather large-scale fiscal policy, particularly in the depressed regions. Also steps to reduce the indebtedness of these countries.
You've got to explain for our listeners and viewers fiscal policy.
So you're saying more loans to
Well, here's
Greece?
not loans to Greece, right? Think about it this way. Imagine that you want Greece to grow.
Yeah.
One of the ways they could do this is by becoming a logistics hub for the region.
Right.
That would mean building out their ports. That would mean increasing the rail infrastructure so you can move things efficiently across the territory, connect with the Balkans, become part of the German supply chains, etc. All of this will pay off, but it will take a while.
Okay, so
and it
the
requires
Germans would become, for instance, the Germans would become bondholders for a...
Yeah, or they could be equity investors.
Okay.
They could basically, buy, there'd be shares rather than debt that would do it.
Right.
There are ways that you could take the existing stock of debt, which they're not paying much on in terms of GDP, but their GDP is so depressed, it becomes a real burden. There are ways that you could reprofile the debt, etc., more aggressively. There are things you could do. But fundamentally, there's no magic wand to fix this. It's a currency that once you've made this choice, it's very hard to get out of. It definitely benefits, I would say, the Germans, the northern exporters in the Eastern Bloc that are part of the supply chain. But that's contingent upon squeezing, austerity, being a permanent state of affairs in the Western countries.
At some point, though, somebody's going to leave, possibly
But it's
Italy.
very hard to do so.
Well, I know it's hard to do, but it would be very difficult, I think, for Greece to leave, because if you said, put your money in drachmas now, put your euros in drachmas, nobody would do it.
And there'd be a run
But
on
maybe
banks.
if you said put your euros in the lira, people would be more encouraged. It's more of a robust. Italy's more robust. It has its problems, but there's a possibility there, and there is some national pride. There are people who could leave. Probably, to my mind, I'm no economist. The whole thing be solved if Germany left.
Well, that's actually part of the proposals that comes from people such as AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, which is some of the economists originally associated with them said, we can solve this problem, we can get out. Then you can have the euro and we'll still have our competitive industry. And that would be one way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
The Italians may leave. I've actually thought about that, whether basically the Italian investor and industrial classes say this is essentially eating us to death slowly, it's time to get out. But I come back to that problem of redenominating big currencies.
Right.
I mean, if at the end of the day you say the Italians have got assets, no doubt about it, they've got some world-class firms, but they haven't grown in 20 years. The average age of an Italian is nearly 44 years old.
Right.
Their debt to GDP is very high because their private debt's very low, but it's still a lot of debt out there.
Right.
You put a big shock in that economy, that could be bad. If Brexit's already causing negative effects for the rest of Europe, they're not even in the euro. If anyone else were to rock the boat might sink, and that's the big fear.
What is the long-term effect of debt in the U.S. terms? I mean, we have politicians who get enormously excited, and then we have politicians who say deficits don't matter.
Yep.
Famously, the Vice President Cheney said deficits don't matter. Then we have whole organizations that say there is nothing worse happening in the U.S. than debt.
All of which are funded by billionaires who don't want to pay a wealth tax. Let's put that on the table. But we'll go with that.
Is there a magic number in relation to growth, in relation to GDP of debt that's reasonable? Because nobody has a plan to balance the budget that I've heard recently.
Well, let's start with the idea of balancing the budget. It's a good way to think about it. Intuitively, you want to balance your budget. But here's the difference. Households and firms and states are completely different things. So I have to live within my means. But the government prints money and taxes people who haven't been born yet. Right. It can issue debt today, which will be paid back in 50 years. So the notion that it has to live within its means, it creates those means. Now, let's bring us back to the US. A very important point here. All this stuff about China owns all this US debt, etc. It's nonsense. Go look at the numbers. The US, in terms of foreign ownership of debt, has some of the lowest in the world in comparison to other countries. But here's the thing. You've got an aging global population.
Right.
There's a global savings glut, as economists call it, which basically too many people are saving.
And not spending.
And not spending. And you have a very big inequality skew, which means that you've got a lot of cash locked up with very few people. Now, in such a world, what are you going to do? Where do you want to put your savings? Now, you could put them in China, but if you don't believe the growth statistics, why would you believe the banking sector? Now, you can put it in Europe, but we've been going through all the reasons why I think it will be there in 10 years, but I could be wrong. Do you honestly think the US dollar is not going to be there in 10 years?
The other thing is we've got a young society. And,
You've still
and
managed...
this is one of the reasons why you'd want to put your money here, because we actually can show
But if we look too attractive,
society.
the dollar gets too hard, and then we can't export.
Yeah, but we gave up on exporting in real terms a long time ago.
Yeah,
we basically
absolutely.
live off of the remittances of other people who want to send their money here. So look no further than Boston. Go up the road and have a look at all those condos that are going up. That are basically financed by Chinese investors who don't trust their own government or their own banking system.
California
and would basically,
is another case in point.
Vancouver, it's happening all over the world. They'd rather buy dollar assets than anything else. Now, they don't live here, they don't go to school, they pay real estate taxes. Tell me how this is unsustainable. It's unsustainable for China, it's not unsustainable for the United States. So long as, to use one of my favorite phrases, we're the most attractive horse in the glue factory, it kind of works.
Talking about the glue factory, Brexit, the future of the United Kingdom, which I asked you, being well advised by your accent.
Yes. I'll go get my bagpipes.
That you might. I actually went to a school where we had a very fine pipe band. It was in Africa, but it went and toured Scotland and won all sorts of awards. We even had some dispensation to wear one of the tartans, and I forget which one. Never mind.
Yes.
Future of the United Kingdom. Future of Scotland, would it be viable on its own? It has not done well economically since the Second World War.
And it also has an old population, and it's run by a party called the Scottish National Party, who, to my mind, are very much like the Parti Québécois in Canada.
Yeah.
That what they do is we want independence. Once they go to the central government and you get more goodies, you say, we're going to go independent. That's give us more goodies. I want more goodies. And then finally, when it comes to it, it's like, okay, we want independence. Well, what was the independence on offer in 2014? We're not going to have a military. We'll have a wee bit of yours. We're not going to have a currency. We're going to just use yours. And that'll be fine, right? It's like, what are you, a teenager living in my house? This is like teenage sovereignty.
I mean, it's like independence not as such.
Yes, exactly. It's teenage independence, right? Now, if you really want to be independent, fess up and say, it's going to hurt, it's going to take 5 years. We need to open up a bond shop for our foreign debt. We need to have a currency of our own. We're going to end up with a big budget deficit. You're either going to have to pay more taxes or have less services. You're going to have to be a lot more productive than you are just now because you're not going to have those transfers coming from England, and they are net recipients of transfers. All of that's true. But here's the thing. Scotland's been in a tough place for so long, it's very easy to blame